Okay, good morning, everybody. We're here today to go over Martus for worksheet proposals for fiscal year 22. Today we do have a lot to cover. I'm going to do a quick highlight of an overview of the tribe's policies on budget proposals, an overview of the budget types, a little bit about the carryover process. I think we get a lot of questions about that each year. And then we'll get into the Martus worksheet proposals and the different methods we can use to enter our budgets into Martus. And if we do have time, we'll get into some reports that can help us prepare our budgets. So quickly, each program is responsible for preparing their budgets for existing and continuing grants or for any new budgets that they'll have. SRD is the resource for the 638 contracts. So if anyone has seen Ken LeDoux's memo that went out in April outlining an expected timeline for 638 contracts and when the deadlines are for budget. And then the finance office was responsible ultimately for the indirect costs and general fund budgets. And if you've seen earlier today, Lynette had sent out an email, or an email had gone out to everybody with asking that budgets be prepared by June 1st. And there was a sheet provided that gives everybody like the payroll costs and how you can budget for payroll taxes, unemployment, federal taxes, life insurance, and the other benefit programs. So if the dollar amounts from prior budgets aren't very helpful because our staffing has changed, those will give us the rates there. And that's the second page of the memo that went out today. Once our budgets are prepared and they're put together, they do go to Budget and Finance first. And eventually, once it has their approval, it goes through Tribal Council to review and give the final approval. So the budget types, the first type is the general fund, funded directly by the tribe. There's no carryover for this. So if your program has any budget savings that doesn't move to your funding source the next fiscal year, all your new proposals must be prepared by each of the programs. The reports you can use to help with that are the fiscal year series of financial reports and the intact budget comparison report, which will provide you with historical budgetary information. And with the general fund, your funding source stays the same year over year. So when you're working in Martus to input fiscal year 22, you can feel pretty confident that the funding source you have now is the one you can use to prepare fiscal year 22. Indirect costs is funded through the collection of a percentage of labor costs from the support of grant programs and other tribal funds. Just like general, there's no carryover. New proposals are prepared by the programs. They also use the fiscal year series of reports. The intact budget comparison report can be used to look at your budget year over year, to look for any trends or changes in how it's been budgeted. And the funding sources remain the same. So if we're preparing our FY22 budget, we can also feel confident that we're using the same funding source. And then the casino is virtually the same as general fund and indirect. There's no carryover. New proposals are prepared by the programs funded through the casino funds. They also use fiscal year budgets, and the intact budget comparison can help with a year-over-year comparison to determine how the budget is trending. And similar to general, this can be a volatile budget, as we've seen with the last year for fiscal year 2020. Revenues can be impacted and result in our budget changing or being reduced beyond stuff we've anticipated. And then we have the federal and state grants funded by an award, typically through an application and award process. There is carryover that can be determined based on grant conditions. The length of the award is determined by the grant. Typically, it's a time-based grant or award. New proposals are prepared by programs, and the financial reports that you'll use to support Any activity you have would depend on the grant. Any grant that lasts just one fiscal year for the tribe, matching the tribe's fiscal year, you could use the fiscal year reports. Multi-year grants use life-to-date reports. And then if you're granted an extension to spend beyond the 1 year, you might move into a life-to-date report so we can collect your spending over multiple years. Federal and state grants, they might experience a change in their awards. So I show an example here, but Head Start, they go with 578.18 for fiscal year 18, and then 19, 20, 21, and so forth. So your funding source may change, which will become an issue with preparing your budget in Martus. If your funding source doesn't yet exist and you want to go into Martus and prepare your possible new budget for your new upcoming grant, you're going to need to work with your program monitor to make sure the funding source is created first before you can prepare the budget. And then we have the 638 contracts, which are funded by contracts issued through BIA or IHS. No carryover for budgeted funding sources. The budget continues every year it's permissible to spend. So this could result, as we experienced when you're doing a change request, that the budget may exist in the original funding year and not the actual year we're operating in. New proposals are prepared by programs based on anticipated contract awards with cooperation with SRD and Health Admin. They use the life-to-date reports. You can use the intact budget comparison to look at year-over-year budgets, and the funding sources do change with each new contract. And the last type of budget we have is the revenue funds, which are funded by the receipt of revenue. Carryover is processed every year to move the fund from the outgoing year into the new coming year. New proposals are prepared by programs. They use the fiscal series of reports until we switch over to the new fiscal year. So at the end of this year, on October 1st, they can begin using a report called Revenue Funds Current and Prior until carryover is completed. Typically, carryover is done about November 15th or whatever date we determine to close the books on the outgoing fiscal year. And for them, the funding sources stay the same, so budget per preparation in Martus is a lot easier and doesn't require waiting or working with a program monitor and anticipating a new budget or a new funding source. So this is a brief thing on the carryover. It's processed each year to move the fund from the outgoing year into the new year. The program monitors are responsible for performing carryover. They base it on a report in Intact under the general ledger called your trial balance. And they determine the most likely amount of spendable funds available at 9/30. The responsibility of the programs is to make sure that by the closing period of a fiscal year, the November 15th date, all purchase orders are closed, all fiscal year bills have been paid, all activity is done, so that when the carryover is done, it only needs to be done one time and not have to be continually calculated as we remember to pay open bills and that kind of stuff. So that could delay processing carryover, delay moving you into a new fiscal year if you're a carryover revenue-based fund. The monitors start with the cash balance and review the balance sheet accounts to determine how much you can spend, how much is obligated, like through payroll and things like that. And then the balance is obtained and they enter a journal entry, which increases a revenue line item called fund balance carryover general enterprise. And so for you programs that have carryover, when you see a balance there for the year, and it's the indication that carryover has been complete and you can move forward with budgeting those funds. And then for the handout that I'll email after this, I have a little sample worksheet of how they calculate your carryover, which is taking the cash, subtracting any outstanding accounts payable, payroll, any payable travel advances, that kind of stuff, to determine what can be brought forward into the new year. So the report I was talking about in Intact budget comparison. So this is a great report to use if you're preparing your budget. I have a snapshot here of one of the budgets, and you can see the Intact budget comparison shows your year-over-year budget. So this one's got 4 years, the current year, 2020, 2019, 2018, and you can see the amounts changing or whatever the trend would be for your program. By running a report like this, to use that as a trend basis for what are we going to propose for FY22. You can potentially spot anomalies with how your budget is going. For like FY20, a lot of programs might have seen a reduction in income. In this case, this program actually seen a large jump in income from FY20. And for a lot of our budgets, were supplemented because the CARES Act provided budget money. Some of the grants got special CARES money for their grants. And so we'd want to be able to spot out those anomalies so we don't assume that in this FY20 $20 million revenue that could continue forward. We'd want to make sure our budget stays realistic and grounded so we don't set up an expectation that we can't meet in the next fiscal year. But the previous 2 years are a little more static. They're staying the same there. And through today, they're at a $266,000 collection of revenue, which puts them more on pace to match the other 2 years before FY20. So that might be something, if you're looking at how to budget going forward, that we would take that out of consideration and use the previous 2 years to develop a trend. Our budget should aid the planning of operations, use supported assumptions, help develop our control activities, what we're going to evaluate and communicate to people who would question our budgets. So we should be keeping these things in mind as we develop the budget. And then, of course, the memos from Ken and then coming out of the finance office are asking for the scope of work, the 1-3-5-year plans, and other documentation that support our proposals and future anticipated business needs. If you need funding sources because you have new grants coming up or expecting a new contract, make sure you work with the program monitor to get those added before you start working in Martus. There's no way to create a funding source in Martus. What's there is just what currently exists. So just make sure you do that so you don't have any frustration, or to prevent us from loading or proposing a budget and a funding source we're no longer going to use, which can impact or delay preparation of the draft budgets to get to tribal council. And make sure we use the chart of accounts accordingly. We use accounts like other program supplies to put a lot of stuff there just because it fits. But we do have a pretty robust chart of accounts. Things like advertising and stuff like that do not need to be budgeted to be spent out of other program supplies. We have line items for that. If you're unsure of which chart of account to use, how to navigate to that, ask someone in finance to help. We can show you how to access the chart of accounts in Intact. We want to make sure we appropriately classify our potential spending. We've seen instances of office supplies being used for people to charge vehicle fuel. So just make sure we're also classifying everything the way it should be. Okay, so let's work on